Our final meeting together about this, just for anybody who did not get a glossary or a week 5 recap, they're right up here on the table. And yes, I know a lot of people are still getting their food and all that, and feel free to go get seconds and when you're not going to disturb anything. So, nice. All right, a lot of people have asked me, well, how do you wrap this up? How do you tell the rest of the story? Because we've kind of come to an end when it comes to Pontius Pilate. And we spent 5 weeks with him. We followed him all the way through to the end. So what comes next? Well, what I've used to wrap this up is something that's called the items of interest. And this is a little bit different than what we've been doing for the last 5 weeks. So there isn't one overarching story to tell anymore. Instead, there are little things, sometimes archaeological things, sometimes here's what happened to this person that we've been talking about for five weeks. That's where that glossary you have comes in handy, because sometimes I'm going to mention somebody and you're going to be like, yeah, I remember him mentioning that, but who was it? Well, you can actually look it up in the glossary and it can help you out in that. Now, where we're going to start with our items of interest, this will give you a little idea of how today's going to go, is we start with something called the Pilate stone. So in 1961, in the present-day city of Caesarea, a stone was unearthed during construction, and it provides physical proof of a biblical character. So Pontius Pilate, when he was prefect of Judea, he erected a Tiberium, a building, and engraved it with his name. And the discovery of the stone settled an argument that's been going on for 2,000 years. Was Pontius Pilate the prefect of Judea, or was he something called the procurator of Judea? And with this stone, we can settle it because we have it in Pontius Pilate's own hands, what his title is. So here is the translation for it. Do I have it up there? Go ahead and put it up there. Okay, delayed, yeah. So Pontius Pilate chiseled into this stone, and here you see it in Latin. I'll give you the translation. It is to Tiberius Caesar, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. So this Pilate stone that they unearthed from the ground, it's partially damaged, as you can see, the damage along it, but it's a unique find with something with Pontius Pilate's name on it and that he erected. It also means that when he was giving gifts to Caesar, and remember the whole shields episode where he had given a shield, all these shields to Tiberius with his name on it, he didn't stop there. He also dedicated buildings to him as well. Now, the next one I want to talk about is something that plays an absolute part in the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection, and it is called the Caiaphas ossuary. So, in the year 1990 in Jerusalem, they were building a park, and they were using a bulldozer to go ahead and move some land to create this park. But something went wrong. One of the bulldozers started to sink into the ground, and as a matter of fact, they had to pull it free. And when they pulled it out of the ground, they found 12 ossuaries in the hole. Now, what an ossuary is in the 1st century AD, they were running out of space to bury Jews around Jerusalem, because you can only bury them in certain places. So how do you go about burying people who want to be buried in Jerusalem, but there are no graveyards left? And what they came up with is something called an ossuary. And it's known also as a bone box. So what they would do is they would get a tomb with a big stone in front of it. Sounds familiar, right? And they would put somebody who died, a relative of theirs, into the tomb, and they would leave him there for a certain amount of time. Now, what eventually will happen is the flesh will decay and the bones are left over. The family would then re-enter the tomb, and they would collect the bones and they would put them in what's known as an ossuary or a bone box. And they would gather all of these ossuaries into a chamber just for one family. Well, that hole that they found when they were building the park was the collection of ossuaries of the Caiaphas family. So in that box, what they found an ossuary, and in it were the bones of a man who was 60 to 70 years old. And inscribed on the outside of the box, it says, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. So there's little remaining doubt that these are the bones of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest that sentenced Jesus to death. Now, it's kind of strange that for some reason this amazing archaeological discovery, it's not really common knowledge in the Church of Believers. However, it's really one of the major finds, archaeological finds, that bears the name of a biblical figure. So we actually have the bones and the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas. And you can see what it looks like. This is actually it right here. And it is housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And that is what eventually happens to Joseph Caiaphas. Now, one last thing on ossuaries before we move on. In light of this practice of second burials in Jerusalem, it's very possible that the incredibly unselfish gift of Joseph of Arimathea, which was to give his new tomb over to Jesus, it's very possible that was not meant to be a permanent gift. It's very possible that Joseph thought to put Jesus in the tomb, roll the stone in front, and then after a certain amount of time, go in, collect Jesus' bones, and put them in an ossuary. But that didn't happen because of the resurrection. Now, we're never gonna know that for sure. Perhaps just Joseph of Arimathea was giving it to Jesus forever, but it's pretty unlikely because these tombs were very, very rare. And because they were so rare, and by the way, not even the Caiaphas family had new tombs. Because this was so rare, and Joseph of Arimathea had one for himself, plus you take into account all of the spices and aloes that he and Nicodemus used at Jesus' burial, you start to get an idea of how exactly wealthy Joseph of Arimathea really was. So, now let's move on and talk about the death warrant for Jesus. So one of the despairs that people who study ancient texts, kind of like me, one of the despairs we have is that so little of the original works are left. Now, what happens to these works? Fires and natural disasters account for a lot of them that have gone missing. But the Roman Catholic Church actually accounts for many of the destructions of older things as well. So the ancient Jewish traditions and histories written down in the book called the Talmud are a prime example of that. So in the Middle Ages, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church decreed that all copies of the Talmud were to be seized, and they were to be either destroyed or rewritten. And why is because they mention either Jesus or Mary in a light that they didn't like. So this type of censorship really removes some of the very valuable tidbits that we get from history that can become very important. Now, in 1991, an ancient version of the Talmud was discovered, and it predates that Roman Catholic censorship in the Middle Ages. So we can actually page through it now and find out a lot of the Jewish histories right around Jesus' times. And one of the things that you find in that ancient copy of the Talmud is the death warrant for Jesus that the chief priest issued in Jerusalem all the way back in 33 AD. And here's how it reads. So it says, on the eve of Passover, they hung Yeshu the Nazarene. So I'm translating here. There is no J, the letter J. So we call Jesus, Jesus, but that is a Greek translation. His Hebrew name would have been Yeshua. So, and the Nazarene would be the Nazarene. So they're talking about Jesus here. It says, on the eve of Passover, they hung Yeshu the Nazarene, and a herald went forth out before him for 40 days, saying, Yeshu the Nazarene will go out to be stoned for sorcery and misleading and enticing Israel to idolatry. Anyone who knows anything in his defense must come and declare concerning him. But no one came to his defense, so they hung him on the eve of Passover. So there's a lot that we can learn from a little thing like this that's a recording of the Jews all the way back in Jesus' time. The first thing is that if the chief priests would have caught Jesus outside of Jerusalem, there is little doubt what they would have done. They would have stoned him to death right then and there. But then that fated Passover, Jesus was definitely in Jerusalem, and so was the prefect of Rome. So they didn't have a choice. They couldn't stone him at that time. They had to bring him to Pontius Pilate. Now, the disciples must have also have known about this death warrant that was out for Jesus 40 days before he died. So when we read about the Last Supper and we read about the Garden of Gethsemane, we come to the only time in the Bible where the disciples are armed. Peter has a sword, and we talk about what he did with that sword in the ear of Malchus. But why? Why would he have a sword? More than likely because of this death notice that was passed around. Now, a death warrant like this also could hardly have been missed by a Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, either. And I'm pretty sure that Pilate would have been very upset about this death notice, because the Jews didn't have the ability to do capital punishment. In Judea, there's only one person that had any say over executions, and that's Pontius Pilate. And that could be very much why he was so aggravated enough to start a Roman trial when they brought Jesus to him, rather than just rubber stamping the decision of the Sanhedrin. Pilate needed to remind them that he was the law when it comes to capital cases, not the Sanhedrin. So we get a kind of a backside view of the trial of Jesus and why Pilate did what he did on that day. Now there's one more note about this death warrant. Is you'll notice that the death warrant for Jesus mentions sorcery, which in a backhanded kind of way confirms that Jesus had powers that normal men don't. And now we know that it wasn't sorcery, but this is how the chief priests would have viewed it. But once again, we have confirmation from outside sources that Jesus had supernatural powers. Now, throughout my 5-week Bible study so far, we've mentioned one particular historian over and over again, and his name is Josephus. And he was, I got to tell you, an excellent historian. He recorded almost every aspect of Jewish life, and in his works, he couldn't but help record this event of Jesus being crucified. So this is not part of the Gospels. It's not part of the Bible, but even Josephus records what happened. But there's a problem with it. Is when the early Roman Catholic Church got a hold of Josephus's writings, some monk who wasn't the brightest decided that he didn't like the way that Josephus wrote it, so he changed what Josephus had to say. And his editing of Josephus's work was so poorly done that everybody who studied this work for 2,000 years has basically agreed that that section just needs to be thrown out. And that'll go for either Christians or not Christians. Whoever was studying Josephus said, you know what, that's not even in his style, in the language he uses, nothing like that. But in 1972, there was an older version of Josephus's writings in Arabic that was discovered. And this copy was dated before that infamous editing by the monk. So finally, we could read what Josephus really said about Jesus. We'll put it up on the board for you. Here's what Josephus in his history records about Jesus. He says, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive." Excuse me. "Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. and the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. So once again, here we have confirmation of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection from outside sources, and one of the best known historians of all time recorded it. And by the way, he would have been there for it. Now, Josephus mentions Jesus one more time in his writings, or really he rather talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and how he died. So in 62 AD, the Roman procurator, the guy after Pontius Pilate, he died while he was in office, and Rome sent another procurator to take his place. But the high priest of the Sanhedrin at the time was a Sadducee with just a horrible reputation. His name was Ananus. And one of his despicable acts was to seize Jesus' brother James, who was head of the Christian church in Jerusalem at that time. He seized him, held a quick trial, took him outside the city, and stoned him to death. And so here's how Josephus records it right here. He says, being therefore this kind of person, he's talking about Ananus, the evil high priest, and calls him a heartless Sadducee. Ananus, thinking he had a favorable opportunity because Festus had died, that was the Roman procurator, and Albinus was still on his way, that's the new prefect coming in, called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, brought in the brother of Jesus who was called Messiah, whose name was James, and some others. He made the accusations that they had transgressed the law, and he handed them over to be stoned. So it's curious that the Roman Catholic Church left this passage alone, as it seems to be just pure and genuine Josephus. So normally the Catholics are incredibly touchy about the Virgin Mary. They hold that she was a virgin forever for some reason. Even though all other sources, including the Bible, refer to his siblings, the Catholic Church still holds that Mary was a virgin forever. But with this verse, you can tell, even Josephus calls him the brother of Jesus. But they didn't. They didn't change this passage like they changed the other one. Now, notice how the Sanhedrin acted without a Roman governor close at hand, right? So keep this in mind when reading about that death warrant that Jesus had. If they would have caught Jesus outside of Jerusalem, they would have stoned him. And they were pretty bold here when one prefect dies and the other one to take his place is coming, and this guy steps in and commits this evil act. Now, if you're wondering about the fate of this evil high priest, Ananus, he did not last long after the murder of James. The people were so upset by this incident that they wrote a letter to Herod Agrippa. And we're going to get into Herod Agrippa's story. He's a grandson of Herod. And then they sent an embassy to that new Albinus, that new Roman prefect coming in, and complained to him about what this high priest had done. And Agrippa went down to Jerusalem and immediately deposed this high priest and appointed a new one. So there was his last act as high priest. Now, Josephus we talked a lot about, but there are two more Roman historians that you may not have known we've talked about them, but we've talked about their works quite a bit. Their name is Suetonius and Tacitus. Now, these Roman historians were not Jewish like Josephus, they were Roman. But they actually, in their histories, give us our first mention of Christians outside the Bible. So it seems that in 49 AD, there was a riot in Rome between Jews and Christians. And this caused the Emperor Claudius to expel all of the Jews from Rome. And he records it like this. He says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Crestus, he expelled them from Rome. So the Crestus referred to here by Suetonius, it's a spelling error, actually. It should have been Christus, not Crestus. And they're talking about Christians at this point. So this riot involving Christians, it may have had several effects later as well. It could have something to do with why later the Christians were blamed for Rome catching fire and then put on trial and then executed. And that's probably where Peter lost his life as well. Now later on, Suetonius mentions Christians again, so even outside sources are showing us little flashes of the early Christian church. Now, let's talk about that fire a little bit for Rome. So it happened in 64 AD, And most of the city, about 2/3 of it, burned to the ground in a great fire. And this was during the reign of Emperor Nero. Now, when the Roman historian Tacitus records this fire, he notes that many of the people were starting to blame Nero for the fire himself. And Nero, if you know anything about him, was a paranoid guy, and he was also not the smartest one either. I don't know how else to put it. But as he's recording this, Tacitus also gives us one of the earliest non-Christian references to actually Jesus himself. So in 64 AD, Tacitus writes, consequently, to get rid of this report, and the report they're talking about is the people thinking that Nero started that fire in Rome. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, and then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city, but as the hatred of mankind. So what can we learn about this early reference to Jesus from outside sources? Well, we can learn first that Tacitus was not a big fan of Christians. So we are living in the information age. If I wanted to find something out about a certain religious sect, I could open up my computer, I could Google it, and I could have an answer in about 10 seconds. That's not how it worked back then. Everything was rumor. And when the degenerates that lived in Rome found out that Christians often greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek, well, that led to all kinds of rumors about what Christians did in private. And Tacitus swallowed all of those rumors, right? And the rumors got more wild and more wild. And the early Christian church in Rome said, okay, well, we've got to do something to kind of quash these rumors and kind of actually tell people what we're about. And they came up with something called the Old Roman Symbol. And the Old Roman Symbol lays out for anybody who wants to know exactly what Christians believe in. Now, we know the Old Roman Symbol by a different name today. It's called the Apostles' Creed. So that's where the Apostle Creed comes from. Now, one last thing we can learn from this quote from Tacitus is that the spread of Christianity must have been like wildfire in the first century. Tacitus mentions an immense multitude in Rome. Now, you got to think about this. That's 1,500 miles away from Jerusalem and only 31 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That's an amazing, amazing accomplishment to have that many people put on trial for firing the city. Now, let's talk about another Roman emperor. His name is Caligula. He came into our story right at the end. Caligula is a fascinating story. So he became emperor at a very young age. He's the one who followed Tiberius. Now, Caligula means little boots, right? And so this is in reference to the boots that he wore as a child when he would visit the Roman soldiers in their camps with his father Germanicus, right? And that was his nickname. They called him Little Boots, right? His real name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Nobody calls him that. Everybody calls him Caligula. Now, he took over for Tiberius when Tiberius died, but he was still a young man. And I got to tell you, the people of Rome were super enthusiastic to have a young and dynamic emperor. Remember, Tiberius had exiled himself to Capri for half of his life. He wouldn't even come back to Rome. Even with what happened with Sejanus, he never came back and governed from Rome. He governed from Capri. Well, Caligula had no problem with going to Rome, so the first action was to go back and set the government back in Rome, and the people loved it. And he started many good reforms in the Roman Empire that needed to happen. And then about 6 months after Caligula became emperor, he got sick. And I mean really sick. He got so sick that he almost died. And the people held all kinds of prayers for him to get better. One guy actually said, look, he prayed to the Roman gods and said, if you spare Caligula's life, you can take mine. Well, Caligula did live. But unfortunately, he had turned into something completely different. He started out as a promising young emperor, and when he got better from that sickness, he turned into a total madman. And he started a 4-year reign of terror. His first act was to find that guy that said, hey, if you let him live, you can take my life. He seized that guy and threw him off the Tarpeian Rock in Rome so that his prophecy would come true. And then he started killing senators. And then he elected his own horse to Congress. And that was more of the tame things he did. In fact, he almost bankrupted the empire completely just because he was, like I said, a crazy one. Now, one of the things that he wanted is he wanted to be worshipped as a god. So he demanded that everybody in the Roman Empire give a tribute to him and praise him as a minor deity. Well, the Jews were not going to do that. The Jews said, no, we only worship the Lord, and that's the only one we give gifts to. However, if you would like us to give a gift to the Lord and say, hey, this is in honor of the emperor, we'd be happy to do that. And Caligula said, no. What he said was, instead, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build this giant statue of myself called a Colossus, right? A Colossus is a giant the Colosseum is named after a Colossus, right? So he built this giant statue of himself, and his plan was to transport it to Jerusalem, put it in the temple in the Holy of Holies, to teach the Jews some respect. Well, yeah, that's a problem. Just think, if the people of Jerusalem would riot because Pilate brought in a few flags with a picture of Caesar on them, what do you think their reaction would be to having this abomination happen, right? But at the last moment, that grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, who was a friend of Caligula, he managed to convince Caligula that he'd have to wipe out the entire Jewish nation to accomplish this, because every man, woman, and child would die defending their temple. So how did he do it? Well, Agrippa took a page out of his cousin Salome's book. He wined and dined Caligula, gave him all, showered him with gifts and everything. And Caligula was so happy about this that he told Herod Agrippa, you can choose anything. Choose anything and I'll give it to you. And Herod Agrippa chose to have him not erect his statue in the Holy of Holies. And that ended Caligula's effort to destroy the Jewish nation. And let's talk a little bit more about that Herod Agrippa, because this guy, he has a life story with all the twists and turns of an epic by Homer. And he appears in the Bible several times. He was a grandson of Herod the Great. Now, when Agrippa was young, his father was murdered. Now, because he's a Herod, I think you can guess who murdered his father. His father was murdered by his extended family, because that's what the Herods were like. Now, Herod the Great took Agrippa and he shipped him to Rome, and he asked the Roman emperor to take care of him. And Tiberius took him under his wing, and he said, okay, I'm going to educate him alongside my own son Drusus and the future emperor Claudius. So they were all educated together. But when Drusus was murdered by Sejanus, Agrippa, who was deeply in debt because of his wild lifestyle, was kicked out of Rome by Tiberius. And he went all the way back to Palestine. Now, his family in Palestine sighed. Here comes Agrippa, right? And his uncle, who was Herod Antipas, we've talked a lot about Herod Antipas, and we met him on the day of crucifixion, right? He's the one who sent Jesus back to the Roman court. Herod Antipas paid off most of the debts of Tiberius. And then he said, okay, look, here's how you can pay me back. I'm going to give you a position in my new city that I built called Tiberias, and you're going to be a civil servant for me. Excuse me. But the two couldn't stop arguing. They carried on a bitter quarrel for years until finally Agrippa just quit and he ran north to Syria. And he got a job in Syria, but unfortunately, he was convicted of taking bribes when he was working in Syria, so he got kicked out of there, and they were trying to arrest him. So he says, well, I'm going to sail back to Italy, because I'm doing pretty good. Tiberius still likes me. So he goes to get on the ship, and he's arrested. He escapes custody and gets on the ship and sails away while the soldiers are looking for him, right? He gets all the way back, and Tiberius says to him, fine, if you pay off your debts, then you can stay on Capri with me. And he does. So he works hard, he pays off his debts, and he becomes friends with the guy who's going to be emperor soon. His name is Caligula. And they became very, very good friends. However, as Caligula and Herod Agrippa were talking one day, Herod Agrippa says a little too loudly, because somebody overheard him, that he wished Tiberius would die so that Caligula could become emperor. Tiberius didn't like that so much, so he seized Herod Agrippa and threw him into jail and put an iron manacle with a chain on him. And there, Herod Agrippa stayed for quite a long time, until Tiberius died. Caligula, when he became emperor, freed Agrippa and said, hey, I'm going to give you a large portion of your grandfather's former kingdom, right? And he gave him the much sought-after title of Amicus Caesarius, so friend of Caesar. And so gave him all kinds of protections. Now, Caligula also gave him a gold chain in the exact shape and weight of the iron chain that he wore in prison. So Agrippa takes all this, jumps on a ship, and sails back to Palestine, right, to start his reign. And what we're going to find is that the Jews absolutely loved Herod Agrippa for most of his life, because the twists and turns aren't done yet. In the year 41 AD, Agrippa was back in Rome visiting his friend Caligula when Caligula was assassinated. Now, Caligula, by this time, it had been in a 4-year reign of terror, and he'd killed off most of his own family. The only one he didn't kill was his uncle, Claudius. And the reason he didn't kill him is because he thought Claudius was a complete fool, and it was no threat to him whatsoever. Now, Claudius knew this. He knew the only reason that he was still alive is because Caligula thought he was a fool. So he carefully played the part of the fool to make sure he didn't get killed. Well, when Caligula was assassinated, here come the Praetorians storming into the palace, and what does Claudius think they're going to do? He thinks they're going to kill me. So he hides himself. So they're searching through the palace. They're looking for Claudius, and they see a pair of toes sticking out from behind a wall tapestry, and that's Claudius hiding behind a tapestry, trying not to get killed by the Praetorians. The Praetorians, they seize Claudius. They take him back to the barracks of the Praetorians, and to everyone's surprise, they declare him emperor. Right? But there's a problem. The Roman Senate is totally sick of the emperors. I mean, first they had Caesar Augustus and everything went pretty well. Then they had Tiberius, who wouldn't even come to Rome to rule. And then they had the madman Caligula. They didn't want any more emperors. They wanted to go back to the old ways. And we want a republic where we're in charge, right? So there's a power struggle brewing here between Claudius and the Praetorians and the Roman Senate. And into this steps Herod Agrippa. So Herod goes to his former classmate Claudius, and he says, wait, don't give in. Let me get them in, let me go talk to the Senate, and while we're figuring out the Senate, you can go and become emperor. And Claudius says, okay, do it. Agrippa rushes over to the Senate, and he gets a debate going in the Senate saying, should we let Claudius just be emperor in name only, a figurehead? or should we just go back to the Roman Republic? And they started debating back and forth, and this gave Claudius time to gather all the reins of power into his hands. Finally, the praetorians marched him back up to the palace and declared openly, he's our emperor. All the people looked around, looked at the Senate, who was mired in debate, and they said, we want Claudius too. So all the people declared for Claudius too. So because of what Herod Agrippa did, well, he changed the Roman Empire. There was no second republic. There will never be a second republic because of what he did. Now, in thanks, what Claudius did was give Herod Agrippa the rest of his grandfather's kingdom. So Herod the Great kingdom was split up until this time where it was given back to the Herod family in the shape of Herod Agrippa. But it didn't last too long under Herod Agrippa. So Agrippa, who was very popular with the Jews, decided one day to wear an outfit that was completely spun from silver. And so regal he looked that the Jews said that when he talked, it must be a god talking. And Agrippa did not disagree. And what happens next is recorded for us in Acts 13:23. It says, immediately, because Herod, they're talking about Herod Agrippa, immediately because Herod Agrippa did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down. He was eaten by worms and died. And that was the end of Herod Agrippa. This event is also, by the way, recorded by Josephus as well. But Herod Agrippa, that's a good story for him. But there's another Herod in our story. That's Herod Antipas. You guys have met Herod Antipas before. Remember, he's the one who sent Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle and then sent him back to Pilate. Well, he reigned in Galilee, his home province, for 3 more years after Pilate had left Judea. Remember, Pilate went back to stand trial, but never had to stand trial because Tiberius died. Now, he was never really popular with his subjects, but he was always really popular with Rome. He always seemed to be on the winning side of any political conflict in Rome. And he was so well thought of up to Caligula that he had a very firm power base up there. And they would often go to him in Eastern affairs and say, okay, help us do this treaty with somebody over here, or give us your opinion of what this means. So he was well thought of in Rome. But there is something that triggers his downfall, and of course it would have to do with his family, right? Because the Herods are their worst enemies. So he had paid off, if you remember, the debts of Herod Agrippa, but he continued a bitter quarrel with him for many, many years. Now, at one point, Caligula comes to power, and he gives to Herod Agrippa a big portion of his grandfather's kingdom. Well, that upset Herod Antipas, right? He says, hey, I'm the one that was originally in the will to inherit all of this. So Herod Antipas gets on a ship, he goes to Rome, and he complains to Caligula, how could you do this to me? Look how valuable I am. And do you know anything about this Agrippa guy? Apparently he had no idea that Herod Agrippa and Caligula were best friends. So Caligula is sitting there listening to Herod Antipas just say every nasty thing in the book about Herod Agrippa, his best friend. And then he strips Herod Antipas of all of his titles and all of his properties and all of his governmentship, and he exiles him to Gaul immediately. Now, if you remember, his wife is Herodias, who was originally his brother's wife. And one of the reasons he was not popular with the Jews is he married his brother's wife while he was still alive. Herodias has always been the most self-centered person. She's a Herod, But at this point, she actually said, you know what, I'm going to share in my husband's disgrace. And those two lived out the rest of their lives in disgrace in Gaul. And that is the downfall of Herod Antipas. Now, there's another guy that we talked about in our story. He came in right at the end, and his name is Vitellius. So he was Pilate's boss up in Syria. Now, if you remember, Pilate put down an uprising of Samaritans, and the Samaritans complained to Vitellius. And Vitellius just dismissed Pilate immediately from his prefecture and sent him back to Rome for trial. Didn't even ask Pilate about it, just did it, right? So let's talk a little bit, and you can figure out what happened to Vitellius. So after he deposed Pilate, he actually rode down to Jerusalem, and he was given a hero's welcome by the Jews at Passover. He lowered the taxes on the Jews. He even gave them back possession of their holy vestments, which Pilate had reserved the right to give them that. And he was very, very popular ever after with the Jews. Now, after this, he worked with Herod Antipas to forge new treaties in the East. Then he got recalled to Rome, and he actually governed Rome for a while Claudius was off on his invasion to Britain. And Claudius, when he conquered Britain and came back, he then invited Vitellius in to be one of his main advisors. So things are looking good for Vitellius, but I got to tell you, this guy was always looked at a little bit sideways. His personality was odd. He became completely enthralled with Claudius's wife. In fact, he carried one of her shoes around with him all the time. I don't know. And anytime anybody asked Vitellius about, okay, this is a hard decision, what do you think we should do? He would always just say, I want to do whatever Claudius does, right? He would never give an opinion on everything. So he turned into kind of a coward, right? Now, he actually had a son, and Vitellius' son, confusingly enough, was also named Vitellius, right? And he was a man much in the mold of his father in his personality. He rose to power in the legions, but he was known as a weak man, unambitious. He liked to party, right? But surprisingly, this son, the second Vitellius, became emperor for a short time during the year of the 4 emperors after Nero committed suicide. So in the Bible, we get to see his father in action, but his son actually becomes emperor for a little while. Now, to kind of wrap us up, how are we doing? Oh, I need to wrap us up quick. We'll talk about one last myth and legend of Pontius Pilate. Now, all the myths and legends of Pontius Pilate, and I got to tell you, there are many of them. My favorite has to be the Mount Pilatus one. So this is the myth that Caligula had Pontius Pilate put in chains as punishment for condemning Jesus. And when he was in chains, Pilate decided to take his own life. Now they had a dead body on their hand of Pontius Pilate. What are they going to do with it? And Caligula said, throw it into the Tiber River that runs right through Rome. But the Tiber River spit the body back out because it was too evil, right? I know, it gets better, right? So what did they do? They took the body and they shipped it. They shipped it up to Germany, and they actually sank the body again, this time in the River Rhone. No, that didn't work either. The River Rhone spit the body back out because it was too evil. So they transported the body then to Switzerland, into an area that has a lake and a mountain, and that mountain's about to be known as Mount Pilatus. And they sunk the body in there, and apparently it was big enough to keep the evil of Pontius Pilate. But it was believed that ever after, the area was haunted by a ghost. And the ghost is the ghost of Pontius Pilate. And every Good Friday, this ghost of Pilate would allow himself to be seen seated on the chair in the middle of the lake, and the terrible storms in that area are believed to be Pontius Pilate's fault, as he makes the water rise to continually wash his hands. This is good history, guys. In the year 1585, a priest in the area gathered up his congregation and a plucky band of townspeople, and they marched to the top of Mount Pilatus to confront the ghost. And believe it or not, the ghost didn't appear. I know. But the Middle Ages, it saw like a Pilate fever. So legends sprang up with arguments about his birthplace. He was reputed to be born in Fortingall, Scotland, Tarragona, Spain, even Forchheim, Germany. Everybody wanted to claim that he was born there. Now, legends also sprung up around Procula. Now, Procula, according to the early church tradition, was given the last name of Claudia. That would make her a granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. Now, once again, there's compelling evidence to believe that her first name was Procula, but giving her the name of an emperor on the end, that one's always seemed to me to be a little bit too convenient. But what do we think happened to Pilate? What was his fate? Now, we don't have a complete answer, but it's always been my rule to take the oldest information possible as closest to the truth. The longer the time seems to go by, the more people feel need to embellish a story, as you can tell with what they think happened to Pontius Pilate. Now, in the 4th century, Two early church fathers wrote two famous passages as they relate to church tradition of what happened to Pontius Pilate. The first was a guy that you may or may not have heard of. His name is Eusebius, and he wrote this about Pilate. He said, Pilate, he of the Savior's time in the days of Gaius Caligula, fell into such a calamity that he was forced to become his own slayer and to punish himself with his own hand. For the penalty of God, as it seems, followed hard after him. Now those who record the Olympiads of the Greek with the annals of events relate this. So if we look at this, at first blush, it looks like it's believable history, but if we look a little closer, we can see that Eusebius is quoting Greek sources, not Roman sources. And also later, Eusebius in his works tells us that this is tradition rather than documented history. And we've also found out that church history can be very not accurate, especially 300 years after the event. So for this, I would put this in the rumor category. Now, closer to Jesus' time, the Christian historian Tertullian, he writes in the 2nd century, it was in the age of Tiberius then that the Christian name went out into the world, and he, Tiberius, referred to the Senate the news which he had received from Syria, Palestine, which had revealed the truth of Christ's divinity. Now, he did this exercising his prerogative and giving it his endorsement. The Senate, however, had not approved beforehand, and so they rejected it. And Caesar held to his opinion, threatening danger to the accusers of the Christian. Now, this whole story of Christ was reported to Caesar, at the time it was Tiberius, by Pilate himself, who was in his secret heart already a Christian. Now, wouldn't this be a wonderful ending to the story that Pontius Pilate becomes a Christian? But unfortunately, no. The history just doesn't match up for this. And so as much as I respect Tertullian, the relationship between Pontius Pilate and Tiberius never improved in the 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And you can tell it didn't improve because when Pontius Pilate got in trouble with the Samaritans, he was instantly dismissed and then told to come stand trial. And I highly doubt that if Pilate did meet Tiberius, he'd say to him, hey, guess what I did? I put to death the Son of God, right? So, in fact, Pilate never did meet with Tiberius. Tiberius died before Pilate got back to Rome, so they never met to have Pontius Pilate even tell him about Jesus. And moreover, there's no evidence of Tiberius ever attempting to protect the Christians. And there's no way that the Senate would have told him no. Tiberius was all-powerful. In fact, he was still putting their members to death for their relationships with Sejanus. So whatever he had in mind, the Senate would have been like, okay by me, just don't kill me, right? So unfortunately, we have to dismiss this one as wishful thinking rather than accurate history. So where does that leave us? Well, in 178 AD, so less than 150 years after Jesus' crucifixion, the pagan philosopher Celsus wrote in his book called True Word that an argument against Christ being divine is that Pontius Pilate suffered nothing as a result of condemning a God to death. Now, he doesn't go into detail about Pontius Pilate's fate, but it's evident that as early as 100 years after the crucifixion, there's no tradition of anything bad ever happening to Pilate. So I'm forced to conclude that Pilate lived out his life after being prefect of Judea. I doubt he ever had a trial for the Samaritan thing, but if he did, he probably won that trial. And because he earned, he left his prefecture in disgrace, I doubt he ever had another political position either. The only thing that gives me pause is that a great many people in the Roman government, both past and present, were put to death under Caligula because of their association with the Jews. And Pontius Pilate was forever and will ever be connected with the Jews. So this would have been a very dangerous environment for him. And I got to go. I think I've kept you way too long. Guys, I want to thank you for listening to me talk for 6 weeks. Thank you to my son who does all the recaps and the slides, and my daughter who hands it out. Guys, thank you so much for the 6 weeks. I very much enjoyed it. I appreciate it.